February 3, 1943, Tempelhof Airfield, Berlin. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland stood motionless on the control tower observation deck, binoculars pressed against his face, watching something that should have been impossible. Against the pale winter sky, over 400 American heavy bombers were approaching the Reich capital in a formation so vast it seemed to stretch from horizon to horizon. The Luftwaffe's youngest general, commander of all German fighter forces at just 31 years old, had seen many things in his combat career. 104 aerial victories, 3 years of continuous combat across Spain, Poland, France, Britain, and the Eastern Front. He had personally shot down more enemy aircraft than most pilots would ever engage, but he had never seen anything like this. The Boeing B-17 flying fortresses flew in defensive boxes, stacked layers of bombers, creating a three-dimensional formation that bristled with hundreds of 50-caliber machine guns. Each box contained 18 to 27 bombers. Multiple boxes formed combat wings. The wings stretched across miles of sky, their contrails creating parallel white lines against the blue that marked their inexorable advance toward Berlin. Galland lowered his binoculars and turned to the operations officer beside him. "This is not a bombing raid," he said quietly. "This is a statement of industrial capacity. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today." The formation approaching Berlin on this February morning represented something more profound than tactical air power or strategic bombing doctrine. It represented the complete mobilization of American industrial might, translated directly into aerial armament that filled German skies with machines produced faster than Luftwaffe pilots could destroy them. What Galland and his fellow officers would witness over the following months would fundamentally alter their understanding not just of American capabilities, but of the war's inevitable trajectory. The mathematics of industrial production were about to collide with German tactical excellence, and mathematics always wins. The journey to this moment of terrible clarity had begun 26 months earlier, on December 7, 1941, when Japanese carrier aircraft attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, bringing the United States fully into a war it had been preparing for but not yet fighting. Germany's leadership had watched American military preparation with mixture of contempt and cautious concern. The contempt stemmed from observable facts. America in 1941 possessed a military ranking 18th in global size, smaller than Romania's. American tanks were obsolete designs based on agricultural tractor chassis. The Army Air Forces operated fewer than 4,000 combat aircraft, many of them obsolescent types that would prove useless in modern warfare. American industry excelled at producing consumer goods, automobiles, refrigerators, washing machines, but military hardware required different engineering approaches, different manufacturing methods, different organizational structures. How could a nation oriented towards civilian consumption possibly match German military-industrial capacity that had been expanding since 1933 under focused rearmament programs? The cautious concern came from American industrial potential that German intelligence services had been tracking for years. America possessed approximately 41% of global industrial capacity, according to pre-war assessments. The nation's steel production exceeded German output by factors of 3 to 1. American automobile manufacturing had pioneered mass production techniques that no other nation had matched. If America could translate this civilian industrial base into military production, implications were ominous. But German leadership convinced themselves this translation was impossible, or at least would take years to accomplish. President Franklin Roosevelt had announced ambitious production goals in May 1940, 50,000 aircraft annually, 120,000 tanks over 2 years, 18 million tons of merchant shipping. When these proclamations reached Berlin through intelligence channels, the German High Command's response was dismissive, even derisive. The numbers were obviously propaganda, designed to intimidate Germany and boost Allied morale. Reich Marshal Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe and one of Hitler's closest advisors, reportedly laughed at Roosevelt's announcements. Americans could make refrigerators and razor blades, he stated, but they could never produce the military equipment necessary to defeat Germany. This assessment seemed entirely reasonable based on available evidence and German experience with industrial mobilization. Building aircraft factories required years. Training workers demanded months of preparation. Developing production techniques meant extensive trial and error. Germany itself, with a head start of 8 years and focused military-industrial planning, was still struggling to increase production rates. How could America, starting essentially from scratch, suddenly increase output by factors of 10 or 20 within 2 years? The assumption that American production goals were unachievable fantasy would prove to be one of the most catastrophic intelligence failures in military history. The first cracks in German assumptions appeared in North Africa during 1942 and early 1943, when American forces landed in Operation Torch on November 8, 1942. German commanders expected to face inexperienced troops with inferior equipment. The Americans were indeed inexperienced. Early battles, particularly at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, resulted in humiliating American defeats. German tactical superiority was demonstrated conclusively. But something about American forces troubled German commanders who had fought campaigns across Europe. The quantity of American equipment was unprecedented. Units that suffered heavy losses were fully re-equipped within days. Supply dumps captured during German advances contained more material than entire German armies possessed. American artillery fired ammunition at rates that German forces, perpetually constrained by logistics, could only imagine. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Axis forces in North Africa until his recall in March 1943, sent increasingly alarmed reports to Berlin. Each American infantry division, he noted, possessed more trucks than an entire German corps. American logistics units operated vehicle fleets larger than those available to German armies. The material superiority was not marginal. It was overwhelming, suggesting industrial capacity on a scale Germany could not match. These reports were filed, noted, and largely dismissed by the High Command. Rommel was known for pessimism, for emphasizing difficulties over opportunities. His assessments seemed like the predictable complaints of a commander facing unfavorable conditions. But then the bombers started coming, not in dozens, as German air defenses had been designed to handle, not even in hundreds, which would have strained but not overwhelmed Luftwaffe fighter forces. They came in formations of 400, 500, eventually over 1,000 heavy bombers at once, escorted by hundreds of long-range fighters, flying missions deep into Germany with a regularity that transformed strategic bombing from occasional raids into daily industrial campaigns. The Boeing B-17 flying fortress that filled German skies in 1943 represented American industrial philosophy, made tangible in aluminum and steel. Each bomber was a complex machine, containing approximately 40,000 individual parts, manufactured by hundreds of subcontractors across the United States. 4 Wright Cyclone radial engines producing 1,200 horsepower each powered the aircraft to speeds approaching 300 miles per hour at altitude. The bomber could operate above 25,000 feet, where German anti-aircraft artillery became progressively less effective due to reduced projectile velocity and atmospheric conditions. Most significantly for German fighter pilots, the B-17 carried up to 13 heavy machine guns on later models, creating interlocking fields of defensive fire that transformed the bomber into something unprecedented in aerial warfare. When multiple B-17 seconds flew in tight defensive formations, their combined firepower created zones where attacking fighters faced concentrated fire from dozens of heavy machine guns simultaneously. German pilots who survived attacks on these formations described approaching walls of tracers, a visual phenomenon that captured the psychological impact of facing mass defensive fire. But the defensive armament, impressive as it was to German tactical planners, was not what made the B-17 strategically decisive. What mattered was that American factories were producing these complex bombers at rates that seemed impossible, according to every principle of industrial mobilization that German experience had established. Boeing's Seattle plant alone built 6,981 B-17 seconds across all variants from 1935 through 1945. Douglas Aircraft contributed 3,000 from plants in Long Beach, California. Vega, a Lockheed subsidiary, added 2,750 from Burbank. Total B-17 production exceeded 12,731 aircraft by war's end. Peak production in 1944 saw Boeing building approximately 362 B-17 seconds per month from a single facility. More than 12 bombers per day, every day, for months. This production rate exceeded Germany's total heavy bomber output across all types and all factories combined. The Heinkel He-177, Germany's only operational four-engine heavy bomber, barely exceeded 1,100 total production across all variants despite years of development. American factories were producing complex four-engine bombers faster than German industry could build medium bombers, fighters, or transport aircraft. When General Lieutenant Galland stood on Tempelhof Tower on February 3, 1943, watching over 400 B-17 seconds approach Berlin, he was witnessing the physical manifestation of American industrial capacity that German intelligence had been documenting, but leadership had refused to accept. The bombers were not just weapons, they were proof of production capability so overwhelming that German tactical superiority became strategically irrelevant. Each bomber shot down by Luftwaffe fighters, each fortress destroyed by anti-aircraft fire, was replaced within days by new aircraft rolling off American assembly lines. The mathematics were brutal and inescapable. American factories could build bombers faster than German forces could destroy them. The formation that approached Berlin that February morning flew in what Americans called combat box formations, developed through painful experience over Germany during the previous 6 months. Multiple bombers flew in tight three-dimensional arrays where each aircraft's defensive guns could support its neighbors. A squadron element typically contained 3 aircraft in close formation. 3 squadron elements, stacked vertically and offset horizontally, formed a squadron box of 9 bombers. 3 squadron boxes combined to form a group box of 18 to 27 aircraft. Multiple groups formed wings. Multiple wings formed the entire bomber stream that stretched across miles of German sky. The defensive firepower concentrated in these formations was staggering to German fighter pilots who had to penetrate them. A single group box of 27 B-17Gs, the final and most heavily armed variant entering service in late 1943, carried 351 heavy machine guns total. Each gun could fire 750 rounds per minute. Combined rate of fire for a single group box approached 5,000 rounds per minute across all positions. When multiple groups flew in mutual support, the defensive fire increased proportionally. A wing of 3 groups could bring over 1,000 machine guns to bear on attacking fighters simultaneously. The psychological impact on German pilots was immense and well documented in Luftwaffe combat reports. Pilots described flying into storms of tracers, approaching fortresses through walls of fire, breaking off attacks prematurely because their survival instincts overwhelmed tactical discipline. Even experienced pilots with dozens of victories found attacking these massed formations required extraordinary nerve and discipline that eroded over repeated missions. Galland himself, despite over 100 aerial victories and exceptional combat experience, acknowledged in post-war writings that attacking American bomber formations was psychologically devastating in ways individual combat never was. A fighter pilot engaging another fighter faced an opponent of roughly equal capabilities. Skill, tactics, and sometimes luck determined outcomes. But attacking bomber formations meant deliberately flying into concentrated defensive fire from dozens of heavy machine guns, watching tracers converge on your aircraft from multiple directions, hearing impacts as 50 caliber rounds struck your fighter, knowing that a single hit in the wrong location meant death or disabling damage. The courage required for such attacks could not be sustained indefinitely, especially when pilots understood that destroying one bomber simply meant another would take its place within days. The Luftwaffe developed tactics to counter these formations through bitter experience and costly trial and error. Head-on attacks from 12 o'clock high minimized exposure to defensive fire and targeted the bomber's weakest defensive zone, where early B-17 models mounted only flexible guns operated by bombardiers and navigators with other primary duties. Later models added chin turrets that improved frontal defense, forcing German pilots to adapt once again. Attacks from below targeted individual bombers separated from formations by damage or navigation errors. Side attacks exploited brief opportunities when formations loosened during turns or evasive maneuvers. But every tactic developed through combat experience became less relevant as American bomber numbers increased exponentially. German fighter pilots could perfect attack procedures through months of combat. They could develop individual skills to exceptional levels. Aces like Egon Meyer, who pioneered frontal attack doctrine, could achieve impressive kill ratios, but individual excellence meant nothing against formations of 500 bombers escorted by equal numbers of long-range fighters. By summer 1943, the bomber formations that appeared over Germany with increasing frequency were growing larger with each mission. The raid on Schweinfurt on August 17, 1943, involved 230 B-17 seconds attacking ball-bearing factories critical to German war production. The mission cost the Americans 60 bombers shot down, the highest single mission loss of the war for 8th Air Force. German propaganda celebrated this as a great victory, proof that American losses made daylight bombing unsustainable. But within 2 weeks, the Americans replaced all 60 lost bombers with new aircraft from production. Within a month, 8th Air Force bomber strength was higher than before the Schweinfurt mission. The tactical victory was strategically meaningless, because American production absorbed losses that would have crippled German forces. The second Schweinfurt raid on October 14, 1943, cost the Americans another 60 bombers destroyed and many more damaged. Again, German propaganda celebrated defensive success. Again, within weeks, all losses were replaced. The Americans could sustain such attrition indefinitely. Germany could not. Luftwaffe fighter losses during these missions were proportionally lower than American bomber losses, but German pilots and aircraft could not be replaced at comparable rates. Every experienced pilot killed represented irreplaceable combat experience. Every fighter destroyed took weeks or months to replace from German production. The mathematics of attrition favored the side with industrial capacity to replace losses immediately, and that side was definitely not Germany. General Adolf Galland understood these mathematics with painful clarity by late 1943. As commander of German fighter forces, he received detailed reports from every fighter wing across Germany and occupied Europe. He knew exactly how many pilots were killed each week, how many aircraft were destroyed, how many were damaged beyond quick repair. He knew German training programs could not replace pilot losses at rates combat was inflicting them. He knew aircraft production, despite desperate efforts to increase output, could not keep pace with attrition. Most significantly, he knew that American bomber formations were growing larger every month, while German fighter strength declined despite frantic efforts to maintain it. The numbers told a story that no amount of tactical brilliance or pilot courage could change. In January 1943, 8th Air Force, based in Britain, could dispatch perhaps 90 to 100 bombers on maximum effort missions. By June, that number had grown to over 200. By autumn, formations of 300 to 400 bombers were routine. By January 1944, missions involving 500 to 700 bombers were standard operations. The growth was exponential and showed no sign of slowing. American factories were producing bombers faster than combat attrition could reduce the force. Each month brought more bombers, not fewer. German intelligence services tracking American industrial production provided increasingly alarming assessments throughout 1943. Boeing, Douglas, and Vega combined were producing over 500 B-17 seconds monthly by mid-year. Total American heavy bomber production, including B-24 Liberators built by Consolidated Aircraft and other manufacturers, exceeded 800 aircraft monthly. In a single month, American factories produced more four-engine heavy bombers than Germany built during the entire war across all heavy bomber types. The implications were devastating for German strategic planning. Even if Luftwaffe pilots achieved favorable kill ratios, even if they shot down 2 or 3 bombers for every fighter lost, American production would still replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. The bomber stream would continue growing regardless of defensive efforts. The only way to stop American daylight bombing was to destroy more bombers per mission than American factories could produce per month. This required shooting down over 500 heavy bombers in a single mission, every mission, sustained over weeks and months. Such kill ratios were impossible against formations defended by hundreds of heavy machine guns and increasingly by long-range escort fighters. The arrival of long-range escort fighters in late 1943 and early 1944 fundamentally altered the strategic balance in ways that made German defensive efforts even more futile. Early American bombing missions flew without fighter escort beyond the range of short-range fighters based in Britain. This gave German fighters freedom to attack bomber formations without interference from Allied fighters. German pilots could make multiple attack runs, reformed after each pass, selected optimal attack angles and ranges. But the North American P-51 Mustang, powered by British Rolls-Royce Merlin engines built under license by Packard, possessed range exceeding 800 miles with drop tanks. This allowed P-51 seconds to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, eliminating the sanctuary German fighters had enjoyed in the depths of German airspace. The first P-51 escorted mission to Berlin on March 3, 1944, marked a turning point that Galland later described as the beginning of the end for the Luftwaffe. German fighters attempting to attack bomber formations now faced aggressive American escort fighters with performance equal or superior to German types. The P-51 could match or exceed the speed, climb rate, and maneuverability of German fighters, while carrying enough fuel to remain with bombers throughout their missions. American escort tactics evolved to provide close escort that stayed with bomber formations and ranging escort that pursued German fighters aggressively, preventing them from forming up for coordinated attacks. By spring 1944, American bomber missions involved not just hundreds of bombers but also hundreds of escort fighters. A maximum effort mission might include 700 B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds, escorted by 500 P-51 seconds, P-47 Thunderbolts, and P-38 Lightnings. The combined American force exceeded 1,200 aircraft filling German skies. German fighter forces, despite frantic efforts to increase strength, could field perhaps 300 fighters against such missions, outnumbered 4-1 and facing opponents with equal or superior equipment. The tactical situation had become hopeless. Individual German pilots still achieved victories through exceptional skill and courage. Aces continued adding to victory tallies, but the overall trend was inexorably negative. German fighter strength declined steadily through early 1944, despite increased aircraft production, because combat losses exceeded replacements. Average pilot experience levels dropped as veterans were killed faster than training programs could produce equally skilled replacements. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The oil campaign that began in May 1944 delivered the final blow to Luftwaffe operational capability. American heavy bombers, now ranging across Germany with relative impunity due to overwhelming numbers and escort fighter protection, began systematically targeting synthetic oil production facilities that provided 80% of German aviation fuel. The first major raid struck the Leuna synthetic oil plant on May 12, 1944. Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production, later stated that this raid marked the day Germany lost the technological war. Within weeks, German fuel production dropped by over 50%. By autumn, production had collapsed to less than 20% of previous levels. The Luftwaffe had aircraft. Production continued despite Allied bombing. Factories delivered fighters in substantial numbers through late 1944, but the aircraft sat on airfields, unusable for lack of fuel. Pilot training programs were drastically curtailed. New pilots received minimal flight time before being thrust into combat. Operational units received fuel allocations measured in hours rather than the weeks of flying time needed to maintain combat effectiveness. The final absurdity of Germany's strategic position became apparent during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. Germany's last major offensive in the West required hoarding fuel reserves for months, stripping defensive operations of resources, gambling, everything on one operation. The offensive plan explicitly assumed German armored forces would have to capture American fuel depots to sustain their advance because German logistics could not supply sufficient fuel through normal channels. When the offensive stalled after initial success, German armored columns literally ran out of fuel within sight of massive American supply dumps. Kampfgruppe Paper, the spearhead formation, came within 1,000 feet of a major fuel storage facility at Stavelot before American forces set it ablaze. The Germans watched millions of gallons of gasoline burn, fuel that might have allowed them to continue their attack, while their own tanks sat immobilized by empty fuel tanks. This dependency on capturing enemy supplies represented the ultimate admission of German logistical weakness and strategic desperation. No successful military operation should depend fundamentally on seizing enemy resources to continue. That the German High Command approved such a plan demonstrated how divorced from reality their strategic thinking had become. Meanwhile, American logistics operated on scales that made such fuel constraints incomprehensible. Forward supply dumps in Europe contained fuel reserves measured in millions of gallons. Transport aircraft flew fuel forward when ground supply lines were extended. Emergency air supply operations delivered thousands of tons of supplies daily using transport capacity alone that exceeded Germany's entire logistics capability. The disparity was not marginal. It was absolute, reflecting industrial capacity differences that determined strategic outcomes more surely than any battlefield engagement. General Adolf Galland, watching the progression from 400 bombers over Berlin in February 1943 to 1,000 bomber raids escorted by hundreds of fighters by early 1944, understood that Germany was fighting against arithmetic itself. The numbers were merciless and inescapable. American factories produced more bombers monthly than Germany could destroy in sustained defensive campaigns. American escort fighter production exceeded German fighter production by factors of 2 to 1 or greater. American fuel production, untouched by enemy bombing, provided unlimited supplies, while German synthetic production collapsed under Allied attacks. Most fundamentally, American industrial capacity operating on the far side of the Atlantic Ocean beyond reach of German forces was expanding rather than contracting while German industry struggled under constant bombardment. The strategic situation reports that crossed Galland's desk through late 1943 and 1944 documented the arithmetic of defeat with statistical precision. Each month brought new production figures showing American output increasing while German production stagnated or declined. Each month brought loss reports showing German fighter strength eroding despite replacement deliveries. Each month brought intelligence assessments of American bomber and fighter strength showing force levels growing inexorably. The trend lines all pointed in the same direction, toward German defeat through simple attrition, regardless of tactical performance. Galland advocated repeatedly for fundamental changes in German defensive strategy. He argued for concentrating fighter forces to inflict maximum losses on individual bombing missions, rather than spreading fighters thin across multiple threatened targets. He proposed withdrawing fighters from other fronts to focus exclusively on defense of the Reich. He urged development and production of jet fighters like the Messerschmitt Me-262 that possessed performance advantages over any Allied aircraft. Some of his recommendations were implemented. Jet fighter production accelerated in late 1944. Fighter forces were concentrated for major defensive battles, but these measures came too late and were insufficient to change outcomes determined by industrial capacity differences. The Me-262 represented German technological superiority over Allied aircraft. The jet fighter was faster, more heavily armed, and in many ways more advanced than any American fighter. Germany produced approximately 1,400 Me-262s, an impressive achievement given the circumstances of late war production under Allied bombing. But American factories produced 96,000 aircraft in 1944 alone. The 1,400 German jets were outnumbered by conventional Allied fighters by factors exceeding 50 to 1. Quality became irrelevant against such overwhelming numerical superiority. A Me-262 pilot might shoot down multiple bombers in a single mission using the aircraft's exceptional performance and heavy armament. But if 500 bombers attacked and only 10 were shot down, the mission still succeeded. The bomber stream continued, regardless of individual German tactical victories. The human cost of this futile defensive campaign was staggering and tragic. German fighter pilots flew multiple missions daily, scrambling repeatedly to intercept incoming bomber streams, engaging in combat against overwhelming odds, watching comrades killed in ever-increasing numbers. Average life expectancy for German day fighter pilots by 1944 measured in weeks rather than months. Many pilots never survived their first 10 combat missions. Those who survived longer did so through combination of exceptional skill and remarkable luck. The psychological strain of fighting against such odds, while understanding the strategic futility, proved unbearable for many. Galland himself, despite his position as fighter commander, flew combat missions throughout this period, leading from the front in the Prussian military tradition. He understood that asking pilots to fly missions against hopeless odds required him to share those risks personally. His combat reports from late 1943 and early 1944 described experiences that captured the desperation of Germany's position. Formations of 500 bombers escorted by hundreds of fighters filled the sky from horizon to horizon. German fighters scrambled to intercept, vastly outnumbered, low on fuel due to shortages, often lacking ammunition for sustained combat due to production constraints. Attacks on bomber formations brought concentrated defensive fire that damaged or destroyed fighters, even when attacks succeeded in shooting down bombers. American escort fighters engaged German fighters before they could reach bomber formations, forcing defensive combat that consumed fuel and ammunition needed for bomber attacks. In post-war memoirs and interviews, Galland acknowledged that by early 1944, he privately understood Germany had lost the air war, and by extension the broader conflict. The numbers made victory impossible. American production was expanding while German production declined. American pilot training programs produced thousands of new flyers annually with hundreds of hours of flight time. German training was cut to minimal levels due to fuel shortages, sending pilots into combat with inadequate preparation. American aircraft losses were replaced within days. German losses took weeks or months to replace if they were replaced at all. The mathematics were brutal, inescapable, and determining outcomes more surely than courage or skill. The bombing campaign that the B-17 formations represented was systematically destroying Germany's capacity to continue the war. Refineries and synthetic oil plants burned, cutting fuel production to fractions of previous levels. Ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt were devastated, threatening production of everything requiring precision bearings. Aircraft factories across Germany were bombed repeatedly, disrupting production even when factories themselves survived through dispersal and cover. Underground facilities. Transportation networks, particularly marshalling yards and rail junctions, were targeted with increasing effectiveness, preventing movement of coal, raw materials, and finished products between facilities. The cumulative effect of 2 years of sustained strategic bombing was economic strangulation that made continuing the war increasingly impossible, regardless of military situation on the ground. By early 1945, when 1,000 bomber raids had become routine and German fighter opposition had been reduced to scattered remnants of once formidable forces, the strategic bombing campaign had achieved its fundamental objectives. Germany's oil production was effectively zero. Transportation networks were paralyzed. Industrial production had collapsed across most sectors. Food distribution was breaking down. The population was demoralized by constant bombing. The Luftwaffe, despite having aircraft available, could not fly them for lack of fuel. The army, despite fighting with desperate skill in defensive operations, could not move mechanized forces for lack of fuel and spare parts. The war continued only through inertia and Hitler's refusal to accept reality. When General Lieutenant Adolf Galland stood on Tempelhof Tower on February 3, 1943, watching over 400 B-17 seconds approach Berlin for the first time, he witnessed the beginning of Germany's final defeat, not the military defeat that would come 27 months later, in May 1945. The industrial defeat, the recognition that Germany was fighting against production capacity so overwhelming that tactical excellence and strategic brilliance became irrelevant. The bombers kept coming in ever-increasing numbers, despite everything German forces could do to stop them. By April 1945, the bomber formations that had shocked Galland 2 years earlier had grown to over 1,200 aircraft on single missions. The final 8th Air Force mission flew on April 25, 1945, 12 days before German surrender. After that, there were no targets left worth bombing. Germany's cities were ruins. Its factories were destroyed or idle for lack of power and raw materials. Its transportation was paralyzed. Its military was collapsing on all fronts simultaneously. The B-17 flying fortress that had filled German skies from 1943 through 1945 was ultimately just one element in a vast industrial system. America produced 12,731 B-17 seconds during the war. It also produced 18,188 B-24 Liberators, another 4-engine heavy bomber, 15,683 B-25 Mitchell medium bombers, 9,816 B-26 Marauder medium bombers, and thousands more of other types. Total American bomber production exceeded 60,000 aircraft. Germany produced approximately 18,000 bombers of all types during the entire war across all categories from heavy to light. The production disparity extended across every category of military equipment and war materiel. America produced 88,000 tanks versus Germany's roughly 50,000. America built 300,000 aircraft total versus Germany's approximately 120,000. American shipyards launched 41 million tons of shipping versus German production of roughly 2 million tons. American steel mills produced 81 million tons annually versus German production of 30 million tons. In every category, across every metric, American industrial output exceeded German production by factors of 2 to 1, 3 to 1, sometimes 5 to 1 or greater. These were not marginal advantages that could be overcome through superior tactics or better equipment. These were overwhelming material superiorities that made German defeat mathematically certain once the full weight of American production reached European battlefields. The B-17 formations over Berlin represented this industrial reality made visible and undeniable. Each bomber was proof that American factories could build complex 4-engine aircraft faster than German forces could destroy them. Each formation of hundreds of bombers was demonstration that American production operated on scales German industry could not match. Each mission that returned to bases in England, despite German defensive efforts, was confirmation that the material balance favored America so overwhelmingly that German victory was impossible. Adolf Galland survived the war despite flying combat missions until the final weeks. He was dismissed from command of fighter forces in January 1945 after repeated conflicts with Hermann Goering over strategic direction and resource allocation. In the war's final months, he formed and led Jagdverband 44, an elite jet fighter unit flying Me-262s. The unit achieved remarkable success given its small size and limited resources, but proved strategically irrelevant against the massive Allied air forces that dominated German skies. After German surrender, Galland was interrogated extensively by Allied intelligence services, interested in his insights into German air operations and strategic decision-making. His testimony provided valuable information about German defensive capabilities and limitations. In post-war years, he wrote extensively about his experiences, published memoirs, consulted on aviation history projects, and participated in numerous historical conferences examining World War II air operations. His writings reflected professional respect for Allied, particularly American, industrial capacity and organizational effectiveness. He acknowledged that German tactical superiority and pilot skill were insufficient against overwhelming material advantage. He criticized German strategic leadership for refusing to accept mathematical reality and continuing a war that intelligence services had documented as unwinnable by 1943. Most significantly, he emphasized that modern industrial warfare between major powers was fundamentally an economic contest, decided in factories before outcomes were determined on battlefields. The lesson from watching 500 B-17 seconds approach Berlin in February 1943 was simple but devastating. Industrial capacity determines victory in total war between modern industrial nations. Courage, skill, tactical brilliance, technological innovation, All these matter and contribute to outcomes. But they cannot overcome fundamental disparities in production capacity when one side can build weapons faster than the other side can destroy them. The Americans could produce bombers faster than Germany could shoot them down. This single fact, more than any battle or campaign, determined the war's outcome. The bombers came daily in increasing numbers. German defenses inflicted heavy losses. American production immediately replaced those losses and added more bombers to the force. The cycle continued until Germany's industrial capacity was destroyed and its military capability exhausted. The B-17 formations that filled German skies from 1943 through 1945 represented not just tactical air power, but strategic verdict on the war. They were flying proof that America possessed industrial capacity so vast that German forces, regardless of tactical skill or fighting spirit, could not prevent the systematic destruction of Germany's ability to continue the war. When German officers stood watching 500 bombers approach Berlin, they understood in that moment that they were witnessing not just a bombing raid but the mathematical impossibility of German victory. The numbers were merciless, the arithmetic was inescapable, and arithmetic always wins. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos to your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.